In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Today we're joined by an award-winning author whose work explores history, identity, and the resilience of the human spirit. Stephanie Carpenter is the inaugural winner of the Summit Series Prize from Central Michigan University Press for her new novel, Moral Treatment. She's also the author of Missing Person Stories, which won the 2017 Press 53 Award in short fiction. Her writing has appeared in Copper Nickel, Echo Tone, the Missouri Review, Big Fiction, Crab Orchard Review, and Witness, among many other literary journals. Her latest novel takes readers inside a late 18th century psychiatric hospital where a young woman diagnosed with pubescent insanity must navigate a world that threatens to define her future. Beyond her fiction, Stephanie is an accomplished scholar and educator. She holds degrees from Williams College, Syracuse University, and the University of Missouri, and currently teaches creative writing at Michigan Tech. Stephanie Carpenter, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Terry. Thank you for having me.
What made you decide to write fiction?
Wow. I don't know that I ever thought about not writing fiction, honestly. I was a big reader when I was a kid, and I was always scribbling in notebooks and writing things that I didn't finish. And then in college, I got more serious about it, and I took time off in between each of my degrees, but every time I did that, I longed to go back and study more with other writers. And that for me was a needed environment. I think a lot of people are better equipped than me to pursue a career and develop as writers outside of academia, but I found that structure and I guess in some sense validation really important as I was developing my craft.
How did you land on 19th century mental health?
So the hospital that the novel is based upon is a fixture of my hometown. This is a fictionalized version of the Northern Michigan Asylum, as it was called at the time of its founding, which was built in Traverse City, Michigan in 1885. And when I was a kid, it was being decommissioned. So 1989 was the year it closed entirely. It was the big old Victorian buildings weren't really in use prior to that, but there were still some modern buildings on the campus where people were being treated. And that complex is really in town. There's hiking trails behind it. There's an arboretum on the campus that was planted by the founding superintendent. So it was a space that was open. And in fact, in junior high, the school was right across the street from highway, really from the hospital. And so we would be sent over there to collect leaves for botany projects and things like that. So it was always a space that was open for exploration physically and imaginatively. I was always intrigued by it.
You feature two fascinating protagonists in this book, the doctor and the patient. How did you develop those characters?
So the doctor was the first one that came to me, and that came out of the research I started doing about this place. The style of building that sort of anchors this institution is called a Kirkbride Hospital, and that's named after an asylum superintendent named Thomas Story Kirkbride, who developed this incredibly elaborate architectural plan in the mid-19th century. And he was a superintendent at a hospital in Philadelphia. He felt that by very carefully organizing every element of the hospital, you would create this ordered environment that would help people to recuperate. And all of this is also aligned with what's called the moral treatment, what my novel is named after, which is a method of care that is intended to be humane and nurturing and supportive and replacing earlier, more punitive models of mental health care. So the Kirkbride Hospital that's built in Traverse City is built after the heyday of these hospitals at a point when the profession of asylum superintendency was beginning to question whether perhaps smaller and more home-like buildings would be more effective, more efficient, easier to manage. And as the hospital at Traverse City expanded, that it expanded according to that model with these smaller buildings for specialized care built around the big building. But coming back to the question, the doctor came out of that kind of conundrum. Why did they build a hospital at great expense and with every possible modern convenience according to a plan that was already out of vogue? And my doctor is a person who has devoted his whole life quite passionately to practicing moral treatment and can't quite bring himself to accept that it doesn't really work. The cure rate is very low. People wind up being long-term custodial patients and not progressing. He doesn't know how to fix this. He doesn't know how to change this. And so that's his conflict in the novel, is that he's stuck in this routine. And he's a well-intended person, but he's also oblivious to the ways in which he's getting in the way of forward progress. So that's where he came from. And then Amy, the primary female character, I wanted to make her somebody that felt fairly relatable. She's a troubled teenager. I don't think she's simply a troubled teenager. There is something more serious at work here, but she feels pretty alienated, pretty alone with her parents and the outside world. And some of the ways that she's responding to that reach a point that dangerousness for herself and others and her parents bring her to the hospital out of desperation.
Stephanie Carpenter is our guest. Her website is stephanie-carpenter.com, and her new book is Moral Treatment. The mental health world has evolved immensely over the years. What inspired you to want to go back and look at it at that particular point in time?
Yeah, so I think most of my associations with hospitals like the one in my hometown are One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Girl Interrupted, 20th century associations and accounts of what people's experiences were like there, in an era where people were being over-medicated. There's obviously, especially in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a lot of antagonism between the staff and the patients. And I suppose that was always the dynamic in these hospitals. And maybe when I was researching at least the premises of the moral treatment, I was really drawn to the progressive roots of that. The idea that this was going to be rehabilitative and a way of extending compassionate care to people who had been marginalized and mistreated for centuries, really trying to make a change in the way mental illness was perceived and treated in the 19th century. And I think, unfortunately, with hospitals, a lot of things impeded that. They didn't have effective drug treatments. They didn't really understand somatic or physical causes of mental illness. There were a lot of things that were far beyond our comprehension at this point in time. And so these large hospitals fill up and they degrade. The architecture, the infrastructure degrades. Oversight is impossible as the hospital gets bigger and bigger. Is inertia the word I'm looking for? There's just this sort of degradation of the idea. The idea cannot be fulfilled. So I thought that was compelling and interesting. And I didn't really ever consider moving the timeline forward. I always knew I wanted to write about it after its founding, when it was still fresh and new and there was all this possibility.
Moral Treatment won the Summit Series Prize from Central Michigan University Press. Why do you think it was selected?
This is a prize that is seeking Michigan stories. So I am a Michigan author. The novel is set in Michigan. It's exploring this moment of history in Michigan. And so I think that is certainly part of it. I hope they also were intrigued by the characters and the arc. And I dedicated a lot of time and research to this book. And there's a texture to it that I'm pretty proud of. But also, more importantly, the nuance and the complexity of the characters is vitally important to me. And I hope that nobody seems one-dimensional or uncomplicated. I think even the characters who might seem at first slightly villainous, there's a real complexity to their motives and their desires.
We are both Michigan kids. Did you have any favorite Michigan authors growing up?
I, of course, like everybody, read Hemingway, although I don't know that I knew he was a Michigan writer until later in life. So, the big Two-Hearted River stories, for example, are set ostensibly not so far from where I'm sitting right now, but I'd read the novels. Whether I grasped that he was a Michigan author or not, I'm not sure. I love Bonnie Jo Campbell. I love Laura Kosciuszko's writing. I love Eden Springs, a historical novella that's set at the House of David in Lower Michigan. I think the humor and the texture of that is beautiful. And I like her. I love her campus novels too. I think Mind of Winter is the one that I'm thinking of, about the young woman who disappears at U of M. So that's just a sampling. I think there's a lot of new voices emerging in Michigan and in the upper Midwest, and a kind of latter-day regionalism that I find exciting.
Moral Treatment has had some great pre-publication reviews.
Reviews have been favorable, I would say. I've been fortunate to get reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and Forward Reviews and the Historical Novel Society. And of course, friends tell you they like the novel and you want to trust them. So I'm pleased about that. I have a friend who's trained as a Victorianist and she's excited to share it with some of her fellow Victorianists, thinking that they would appreciate the historical setting. So far, so good.
We're talking with author and educator Stephanie Carpenter about her new book, Moral Treatment. What do you enjoy most about the craft?
For me, and probably for many people, it's when you get on a roll. And it could have been a day where it was challenging to sit down and there were a lot of mental hurdles to jump before you really engage with the piece and get into the flow. But when the flow happens, that's such a good feeling. And sometimes for me, that doesn't mean that much actually got written, but maybe something became clear or a path forward presented itself or a problem I was grappling with was solved in that day's work. So getting into the zone is a really gratifying part of writing. And I love researching. That's pre-writing, but I really do love doing research for a project.
As a teacher of creative writing, what's your pitch to students about why they should love the craft?
I think where I am, I'm mostly teaching students in STEM. And that said, they are self-selecting. They have a range of electives that they could take. And so they're opting to take creative writing. And I see a lot of students who are really passionate about that. So I don't necessarily find myself having to convince them to love it. I think, and I also don't think it's necessarily ethical for me to try to convince them that maybe they should stop being computer scientists and start being writers full time. But a lot of them see it as something that helps to ground them, that helps them to express things that are sidelined in their other academic work or in the careers they're imagining for themselves. And I think my STEM students also know from experience that being creative is really important for being successful as an engineer or a scientist, being able to think innovatively and express yourself in clear and engaging and voice-driven ways. I really do meet some great writers here at Michigan Tech. So convincing them to love it, I don't know that I've ever really had to do that with someone. Certainly in my multi-genre courses, there might be someone who has some reservations about one of the genres. They want to write fiction. They don't really want to write poetry or creative nonfiction. But I try and expose them to enough different examples of that they can find a foothold and see a way into it. And even if it might not be the work that they're proudest of, they're proud of themselves for attempting it.
Great literary voices like Stephen Hawking, Richard Feynman, and Carl Sagan used creative writing to open the minds of non-scientific people beyond the value of STEM to the beauty of STEM. Is that part of the takeaway that your students get after they've been in your class?
That's a great question. We have a lot of courses here that are geared toward writing about science for lay people from one angle or another. So that's maybe the things that they're doing in my class are helping them to hone those skills. But that's not our focus. What we are crafting imaginative writing. So if they find those skills transferable, great. But also I want to invite them to experiment with another mode of writing whose objective is not necessarily to explain scientific concepts to someone else, beautiful though those may be, but to tell stories that are important to them or convey experiences that are important to them, if it's nonfiction or an idea or an image, if they're writing poetry. I think just because they've chosen a STEM focus doesn't invalidate these other beautiful things that they have to say and to share. So maybe they're equipping themselves to better communicate their scientific work through my class as well as through other writing classes at the university. But it's not the main thing I hope they take away.
We are in conversation with Stephanie Carpenter. Her book is Moral Treatment. When students leave your classroom, what do you hope they'll remember?
I hope that they see themselves as writers and creators and originators of story. And as a writer yourself, you probably had these moments where you wrote something and you thought, where the heck did that come from? I didn't know that I had that in me. I didn't anticipate that story coming out. I give a lot of prompts in class that are Oulipo things that are meant to jar you out of your patterns and provoke some sort of new voice or new idea that almost feels as though it comes from the ether. I'm hoping that students in a creative writing class have that experience of wonder, of being surprised by what they did and excited about it.
Do you have more stories to tell?
I do have another finished project I have an agent for that one. And it is a collection of 2 short novels. They're both about women artists in the mid-19th century, so the 1840s, and they're both set out east in Massachusetts. One is looking at a woman who works as a colorist in a daguerreotype studio and gets into some scrapes. And she's a former student of transcendentalist Margaret Fuller, who has died in the lead up to the novella. And so my character's grappling with her teacher's legacy, or her legacy of nonconformity, and what that means for her in her own life. And so she's thinking about some of the choices she's made and reliving them. And so there's a lot of flashbacks in that one. And then moving forward and striking out artistically on her own. And the other in that pairing is set in Western Massachusetts primarily, and is about an amateur portrait painter who is making a circuit through the Berkshires with her new husband. And they, for one reason and another, wind up going into a Shaker village over the winter. And so it deals very much with what in Shaker history is known as the era of manifestations, when a lot of visions were being received in Shaker communities in the form of visual art. And that's something that the characters become involved with. So those two pieces are complete. And I think that they will, I've always imagined them as a pairing, but they certainly could decouple if that's how things work out. They're long enough to stand alone. That project is in the can, and hopefully I'll be out in the world before too long. And then I'm currently working on a sort of speculative piece. It's the sort of a post-apocalyptic myth that imagines what sort of deities might emerge from an environmentally devastated landscape.
I am overwhelmed by the depth and breadth of your creative mind. Where do your ideas come from?
Yeah, who knows, right? For me, a lot of times it's a physical object that kicks something off. Like in the case of the novel, The Hospital. In the case of the Shaker piece, it was some portraits, some amateur portraits I saw somewhere. So the spark, the spark is often something that I've encountered physically in the real world, and then just goes from there.
Stephanie Carpenter's book is Moral Treatment, and her website is stephanie-carpenter.com. It's a fascinating read, and you are a fascinating guest. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Terry.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.